Welcome back. Week 2 of our series all about Jesus. Hope you've had a great week. Last week we were having a look at Jesus and the world that he was a part of, the groups of people he would have associated with, what life kind of looked like a little bit for him. This week we are talking about Jesus and wealth. And I don't want that to put you off. I don't want you to hear that and think, ugh, I don't want to listen. This week's not for me. Not interested. This is really awkward. You don't talk about people's finances and yada yada. That's not what I'm doing. So don't stop the video. Keep coming with me and have a listen. I just want to kind of think about wealth and what it meant for people at the time of Jesus and what does it mean for us now. And I say it every time I do these videos. I'm not here to give you set things and rules to follow and set opinions, and I'm just here to talk a little bit about what I've discovered as I've dug deep in the passages and kind of read commentaries and picked bits out. And what do we think about that? What does that mean for us now? What do you think about it? So we're going to do that a little bit today, thinking about Jesus and wealth. It is a tricky subject sometimes. People can be a bit touchy about talking about money and stuff. I'm not making it personal. We're just having a look at what Jesus said about it, I guess. And as I've already said, the world of Jesus was so different. So we looked at that last week. And, you know, his world was, you know, Jewish law and the Torah and, you know, different to ours. It was a different time. But their world had people who had wealth and those who didn't, and it's the same as ours today. There are bits that mirror kind of just the world in general, humanity in general, and how we treat people and what we do, and having wealth and things like that is something that exists across every society throughout history. So it's still relevant to us now. And our current world is full of people who have lots of wealth. You know, there are more billionaires now than there ever have been throughout history. Again, I'm not giving my opinion on that, but that is just the current world that we live in. And people make decisions driven by making money and wealth and what that will mean and how much money they'll make. And it's a big deal. So we are aware that there are some people within our world who have a lot of wealth and a lot of money. And I want us to have a little think about who comes to mind, you know, a celebrity or, you know, businessman or whatever comes to mind when I say to you about people who have a lot of wealth. Because it's not all, I would argue, a good thing. There will be some real big advantages to their life having that much money, and life must be a lot easier in some ways. However, life must also have disadvantages when you have that amount of wealth for them, and, you know, knowing who is your real friend, who's just around you for your money, and all of these different things. So have a think about that, and have a think about when we think about these people who have wealth like that, more than we can ever imagine, multiple houses and all these things, what comes up for us? Are we impressed? Are we jealous? Are we angry? Are we driven by a desire to have that ourselves? Does money and wealth and having more material possessions drive us and bring us forward? Are we conscious of how people make their money? Are we angered by exploitation and oppression and things that exist from institutions, how they make their money? Do we not really care? Do we not really think about it? Do we think they're happier? Does it matter what we think about it? What comes up for you when you think about wealth and billionaires and all of this thing? Again, there's no right or wrong answer. But what comes up for you? What does it make you think about? And how does it make you feel? Because it's safe to say that, you know, wealth has its influence on our society, and it's complex. Wealth on its own, money on its own, is not a bad thing. It's a tool. It's needed in our society to function, to buy things, to exchange for goods, to, you know, all of these things. It's not a bad thing. That's not what I'm saying. Within the Old Testament, it's the same. It's a double edge. So sometimes when wealth is spoken about within the Old Testament, it's a good thing. It's seen as a blessing from God. It's seen as you've lived a righteous life, and you're seen favorably by God, so you have this wealth. Or it's seen as a sign of wickedness. It's referred to as a bad thing. And there's some mentions in the New Testament within the Gospels about wealth as well. And that's where we're going to kind of have a look today. Obviously, like we said last week, the time of Jesus was very, very different. So there was no social security in place. Within the Gospels, it often talks about if you have wealth, if you have money, to use it. It was expected at the time for it to be used to look after others within your society who had less. Often the text will talk about orphans and widows, and people who were not protected by a benefit system or a community. They couldn't work, they had no rights, they all of these things that maybe we don't need to think about and worry about in the same way anymore. It was expected that you would look after those people within your community. So there are a few passages that we're going to look at, and I know some of you watch as a group weekly and kind of discuss what we're talking about. So in a minute will be a good time to pause and have a little discussion. There's some Bible verses that just have a little think about, have a little chat about who is being spoken to, and what can you draw out, what kind of different things do you notice, zoom out, and what do you notice? Is there crowds? Is there disciples? Is it an instruction? Is it a parable? Who is being encountered? What is happening? What is being said? Have a little chat about that. And the passages are Matthew 6, 19 to 21, Mark 10, 17 to 31, and Luke 19, 1 to 10. So just have a pause and have a little chat about those passages and what you get out of them. And we're back. So we can see from these passages that Jesus, he had much to say about wealth. He had an opinion on it, and to different audiences, to different people, he communicated the message slightly differently. He made it clear to each group of people in a different way what he thought, in a way that they would receive the message and understand, and because it was something of importance to him. And for Jesus, I think wealth was so significant because poverty was increasing, and it was a huge issue for many reasons, and the systems in place were unjust, really, and didn't treat people who were in poverty very well. There are things like Roman tax, so we talk about tax collectors a lot, and so Roman taxation, low wages, lack of work, led to people making bad decisions, and it was essentially kind of steal or starve. People had nothing, and they were not able to, they're being exploited, they were not able to work their way out of it. People were also, there was no laws or governing body or police or things like that to protect other people. So often vulnerable people were scared to go out on their own and travel alone because it was too dangerous. And so a good example of that and that lifestyle and what was happening at the time, and people being robbed for money and all of that, is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And again, I would argue the parable of the Good Samaritan might be a good one to read at the end of this message and think about the way we should treat people and react. And I do love that parable. That is a good one. So there was also a problem of exploiting the poor, people who were vulnerable, we said orphans and widows, and their circumstances were exacerbated and made worse, whilst the wealthy just kept seeing an increase in their own money and power. And ordinary people who were working hard were at risk of starving. And wealth ensured status. Wealth meant you had the power. Poverty was often seen as kind of your fault. You have turned your back on God, and you kind of deserve this. So they would have looked down on you and disregarded you if you were poor, and it meant you had no social standing. And it meant that, I would imagine, I would feel completely rejected and worthless within that society. Rather than it being a systemic issue, it was seen as kind of a punishment from God, or and I would argue that the distribution of wealth and decisions being made to exploit the poor and people getting poorer. And, when we think about the last few years and the reliance on food banks and warm spaces, and the way that people are having to meet need in a way that they haven't for a lot of years, I would argue our current climate is not far off, is not one that is treating people who have less very well, whilst billionaires get richer and richer. So it's something for us to think about. And on the flip side to this, and the flip side of the poor being seen that way and treated badly and seen as less than and blamed for their own problems when it wasn't their fault, it was a systemic issue. On the flip side to all of that, there is also a lot of negative attitudes towards the wealthy and to those who had, and in the time of Jesus. And there are some Jewish texts that I was kind of reading when I was going over these passages. It was really interesting because one of them was arguing that if you are excessively rich, then you will become wicked and you will brag about your wealth and your power and your gain, with no awareness of others around you. And I thought that was really interesting and something for us to think about in our own lives. So what did Jesus think, and what do you think from these passages? I think that Jesus certainly is aware of the dangers of wealth when it is not being used as intended, and when it's hurting other people. I don't think he really cares how it's been obtained, whether it's inherited, whether it's a thief, whether it's whatever, tax collector. He doesn't seem to treat anybody any differently in how they've obtained their wealth. I think for me, when I read it, what the issue is when it's not being used to look after the vulnerable within society. And because people often thought that riches were a blessing from God and a reward, I think when Jesus challenges that, it's Jesus doing what Jesus does best, in that he is turning the world upside down. He is subversing the culture, and he's reversing that view very publicly by condemning having too much wealth and not doing anything with it to benefit others around you. And I just find that really interesting in thinking about, at the time, and how Jesus again comes in and shows us a different way, and doesn't conform with society at the time, and doesn't allow it, and doesn't he's very publicly saying, no, that's not okay. There are people who have nothing, there are people who are starving, there are people who are not being paid fairly. That's not okay. And I think I spent a lot of time looking at the passage in Mark, and for the wealthy man to distribute his wealth to the poor is, I think, what Jesus cares about. Not that he had the wealth. I think it's what he was doing with it. He didn't ask the man to give it to him. He didn't ask the man to give it to the synagogue. He didn't ask the man to give it to his community of faith. He didn't ask the man to give it to his disciples. Asked him to give the money to the poor. He was aware of the culture and the issues and the challenges for people, and he wanted to make their world a better place. So I would argue that that's what Jesus cares about, and it's important to ensure that those who don't have are treated properly and fairly and with dignity and respected and seen as equal in the kingdom of God. and that there's a place for them, and that they're important and they're seen and they're valued, and God cares just as much about them as he does about the wealthy man. I think that's what's important, that they're paid fairly, that they're looked after, that their physical needs are met, so they have food when they're hungry, and they have clothes, and they have a place to stay. And it would have been very different to the view of religious people at the time, who would have seen them as a problem and brought it on themselves. And I think it's really interesting that Jesus so publicly is like, no, that's no. And again, I would argue there's in our society, often people maybe still think the same. And I would imagine Jesus still thinks the same, So it tells us that Jesus has a heart for everyone to be included and to be equal. And so as I come to a close, I told you I was just going to give you a brief overview for you to dig deeper again and have a think about what does this mean? Reflect on what came up for you, and what does this mean now, knowing what Jesus said, how he treated people, who he said these things to. What does it mean for us now? What is it teaching us? What is it challenging us about? What is our attitude to wealth? Has it changed? What can church as an institution as a whole, who maybe doesn't always have the best reputation in terms of people thinking, we expect people to pay tithes and take money from the poor, and as an institution as a whole, not that we are responsible for that, what can we do better? What can we do as part of that to reflect the attitude of Jesus more clearly as a whole? And what are we going to do about it? It matters. So how does what we've looked at today change how we now live from now on? I don't want any of these series to be just like we listen to them and we're like, oh, cool, that's good to know, that's interesting, and then we forget about it and we do nothing about it. What has changed within us? Who can we help? Who can we bless? Who can we pray for? Who can we invite? Who can we include? Whose life can we make better? Who can we look like Jesus to? That's what I want us to take away every time, these things. So what have we learned about Jesus' attitude towards wealth, and what can we do to look like that and carry that attitude and that awareness in our everyday lives, in our communities, where God's placed us, the things we're part of? What can we do about it, whether we've got a lot or a little? What can we do with whatever God has given us in our hands? Who can we help? So I hope that's been interesting, and I hope that you haven't seen it as condemning. It's not that. It is literally just looking at, what did Jesus think about it at the time? What was the world like? What was society like? What is our world and society like now? And what can we do to have that same attitude that Jesus had to people today in the world that we are part of? So, hope you've enjoyed it. Praying for you, thinking of you, looking forward to seeing you hopefully soon. And I'll see you hopefully next week if you watch week 3. Take care. Bye.